I feel like this might just become a thing on my channel where I do these types of reviews because of how dumb I am and how much I enjoy watching these movies. Not to mention the history part of it, of course. So, when I was brainstorming for more video topics, I went down a bit of a rabbit hole on post-war films, especially films set during the aftermath of World War II. Now, there are a lot of those films, of course, that were made that are set during that time period, and all of them were good, some less so, obviously. But some stood out to me, with the common topic being, oh boy, um, the Red Scare. And I do have plans to review a few movies about it. But we'll start off light. At least, I hope we do start out light. So, here we go. The first film that I wish to direct about post-war era McCarthyism, aka the Red Scare. Directed by and written by Irwin Winkler. And starring the man, the myth, the legend himself, Robert De Niro. Guilty by Suspicion. It is in the midst of the Great Depression, the widespread economic hardships of the 1930s that rose along with the spread of fascism resulted in the surge of many leftist movements in the United States. By 1933, membership in the Communist Party of the USA, or the CPUSA, grew from around 20,000 to around over 60,000 by the end of 1939. Now, during this time, this wasn't the only left-leaning aligned movement in the United States during this time. The CPA was just one of many. But, for the sake of simplicity, we won't get into them. That, and because the subject of this video has the CPA as one of its main points. In regards to it, as the movie opens, we're informed about the House of Un-American Activities Committee, which was founded in 1938. Their goal was to investigate alleged disloyalty and subversive activities on the part of private citizens, public employees, and those organizations suspected of having communist ties. In the movie, the committee began to set its sights on Hollywood. As the film opens, we are informed that the first suspects that triggered the infamous blacklist are known to history as the Hollywood 10. On November 25th, 1947, 10 screenwriters and directors were cited for contempt of Congress for refusing to answer questions before the committee, with by far the most popular of the 10 for modern audiences being Dalton Trumbo. Now, just in case anyone is confused, for clarification, when the directors and the screenwriters were cited in contempt, the committee itself wasn't actually the one who made the blacklist. Instead, it was the Hollywood studios themselves. The congressional action prompted a group of studio executives acting under the aegis of the Association of Motion Picture Productions to suspend the said 10 film artists without pay. Besides being laid off from the studios, additional punishments were handed out. This includes a criminal charge that led to a highly publicized trial and conviction, and the possibility of a year in prison to a $1,000 fine, which today would be over $13,000 to $14,000. As a result of this, Dalton Trumbo served 11 months in the federal penitentiary in Ashland, Kentucky in 1950. Once he was released, he continued working clandestinely on major films, writing under different pseudonyms or other authors' names. Additionally, 2 of his works during this time, such as Roman Holiday and The Brave One, won Oscar Academy Awards. Now, moving on from that discussion of the brief background, let's start off the movie. we get introduced to our main protagonist, David Merrill. Now, the character of David Merrill is fictional, but the main purpose of this was to show the experiences of many directors who were affected by the blacklist condensed into a single individual. Of course, it's a lot easier for a movie to do that. The opening sequence brings us to Merrill returning home from a scouting mission for a film location in France, where he's picked up by his screenwriter and childhood friend, Bunny Baxter, who is also a fictional character. After Merrill returns home, he expects to get himself back in business at the studio that he works in, that is managed by Daryl Zanuck. Now, Zanuck himself is a real person. In 1933, he worked under Warner Brothers, but left after he had disputes with the studio head at the time, Jake L. Warner. A few days later, he partnered up with Joseph Schneck. I'm very sorry. He partnered up with Joseph Schneck, god damn it, to form 20th Century Pictures. Between 1933 to 1935, 20th Century Pictures became the most successful independent movie studio of its time. Alongside this, Zanuck negotiated with Fox Studios to merge, creating 20th Century Fox Film Corporation. Now, we'll talk more about Zanuck's character and how it compares to the real-life person later. Going back to David Merrill, once he's been greeted with a special surprise homecoming party, one of his close friends, named Larry Nolan, and his wife Dorothy, got into a heated argument. This was due to Larry being pressured by both the FBI and the HUAC to name names in Hollywood, who might have been associated with the communist movement in the country. This included our protagonist, David Merrill. This led the couple to leave the party quite early, with Dorothy in particular having to be driven home due to intoxication. As for Larry, he's seen burning several books from his own personal library in the fears that he will just be arrested by simply possessing books that are considered communist aligned. Now, I wasn't able to find any specific instances of anybody from Hollywood burning books in their attempts to stay face for the United States government. However, this scene is a great piece of symbolism because it shows you that you could be incriminated by anything you did or possessed in your own personal life. Supposedly, the next day, once David got himself back in the 20th Century Fox film studio where he works, Zanuck quickly gives him a phone number of a lawyer named Felix Graff. Now, Graff is another fictional character who serves as the main legal consultant of Hollywood, per se. The character is another composite figure because, again, it's a lot easier to have one individual to represent many when it comes to a movie. Now, once Merrill meets up with Graff, along with another fictional character named Ray Carlin, who's an FBI agent in the film, they both informed Merrill that he was named a communist sympathizer, but Merrill obviously pushes back on this, saying that he only went to a couple of meetings in the past, but he had never joined the party. However, Carlin gave him names of different people, which included his childhood friend, Bunny Baxter. This is where the main issue lies. Even if these people weren't communists, simply attending a single meeting or a couple of meetings, even knowing other people who are potential suspects, is enough to get you subpoenaed. And with his refusal to cooperate, the movie that Merrill had been working on was pulled by Zanuck. Not only that, he quickly lost a lot of his assets, resulting in Merrill getting blacklisted. He even saw one of his director friends fleeing to London to permanently dodge his own subpoena. Adding on to his challenges, Merrill struggled to find work. In his attempts to try and earn a living, he ended up going to New York to reconnect with his old friends working in Broadway. Initially, he got a warm reception, but was later quietly abandoned as well, because the FBI was quietly following him. And by just that, he couldn't even hold a job fixing film equipment in the aftermath. In the end, Merrill ended up moving back to California with Ruth and his son. As he slowly got his bearings back, it was still a dreadful struggle, as seen from his paranoia when he assaulted someone whom he thought was spying on him. And if you guys thought things couldn't get any worse, well, it did. When both Merrill and Ruth reunited with Dorothy, her life was also in shambles, to put things lightly. She struggled to find work herself, and even lost custody of her own son, all because her now ex-husband Larry labeled her as a communist to the United States government. This led to Dorothy having a mental breakdown, which tragically resulted in her ending her own life. It then came to the point where he simply couldn't handle his already ruined life anymore, which led Merrill to reach out to Felix Graff once again. He asked Graff a question about whether it was wise to plead the Fifth Amendment to the committee. Graff tells Merrill that whilst it is possible and that it would save him from self-incrimination, it would show the narrative that Merrill was trying to hide something. And in real history, this was also the same case for those who were blacklisted. With no other options left, Merrill decided he would attend the hearing to testify before the committee. Before that, however, Merrill's childhood friend, Bunny Baxter, came to his home after he attempted to clear his name to the committee. But the committee inquiry instead found him guilty of perjury when the FBI mentioned his past efforts in donating supplies to the Russians during World War II. This was in reference to the Lend-Lease program, where a quarter of its supplies were sent to the Soviet Union. I personally couldn't find any valid sources of former contributors getting noted as suspects during the Red Scare. It's one of those things where it was outlandish that I honestly can't tell if this is true or not. Of course, it could be a possibility, but I personally myself can't say for sure due to the lack of sources. If somehow you guys know, please leave it in the comments. In his emotional breakdown, Baxter begs Merrill to allow his name to be used, because, in his own words, he is already dead. But Merrill's wife, Ruth, kicks him out of disgust. Again, despite all these three characters being fictional, this scene embodies the horrible effects of the Red Scare when it comes to these Hollywood figures, with the purpose of driving out any small traces of communism and socialism. The government ended up utilizing fear that led to many ruined lives. This finally brings us to the climax of the movie. It fast forwards to February 1952, where Merrill attends a public hearing before the HUAC. At first, during the beginning, it seemed as if he was going to cooperate with the committee. He admits that he attended a few meetings of the Communist Party and that he was never a member. But when the question on where such meetings took place, and in whose homes to be specific, Merrill begins to backtrack. He then dismisses Graff, who was representing him as counsel, and refuses to discuss anyone aside from himself. This led to the committee to press on Merrill relentlessly, bringing up photographs of him attending an anti-nuclear protest in 1946. Now, this part about the anti-nuclear protest happening in 1946 was true, since this was the very start of the anti-nuclear movement, which saw a lot of sympathy and support from people in Hollywood. This being used as evidence by the HUAC is also correct, since this coincided with the growing civil rights movement. What was also mentioned in the hearing was a reference to J. Edgar Hoover, the first ever FBI director, as well as the so-called Hollywood Peace Forum, which was an organization that existed. And, as the name explains itself, it was purely an anti-war group. Now, going back to the movie, the committee then name-dropped the people who attended the surprise party that was at the very start of the movie, along with Merrill's wife, Ruth, and also Dorothy, who is dead. But again, Merrill didn't budge, and by the end of the heated hearing, he was cited in contempt and would spend time in prison as a result of it. It then ended when Baxter had his own turn to testify before the committee, but he was also cited in contempt right after. Both Merrill and Baxter refused to cooperate with the committee's charade because they didn't want to ruin any more innocent lives, all in the expense of their own. And as the movie closes out, it mentions that it wouldn't be until the 1970s that those among the Hollywood Blacklist would be vindicated, all for standing up for a great common cause, their own personal beliefs, and their freedom to express them. Now, as much as I enjoyed this film, many things were quite dramatized, and the fact that the majority of the main characters were fictional, a lot of the stuff shown in the film isn't really accurate to real history, admittedly. And I will also say this with full honesty, as much as I enjoyed this film, it is quite boring at times. But in regards to the usage of fictional characters instead of actual Hollywood figures, personally, I believe that's okay, considering that this part of the history of the Red Scare is focused on Hollywood. In my own perspective, taking big creative liberties to help condense the many different experiences of those affected is probably one of the most logical approaches that they could have done. Though, as I researched more and more for this review, the character of David Merrill is loosely based on a real blacklisted director named John Barry. The biggest difference is that John Barry fled to France to avoid testifying before the HUAC. Whilst he was living in Europe, he directed plays in London and films in France, with his most successful film being Tamago in 1959. He was only able to return to the United States in the 1970s when the Hollywood Blacklist began to fade. In his later years, he would live out the rest of his life in France until his death in 1992. Now, I did say I would return to the portrayal of Daryl Zanuck, which to me is the most accurate in the entire movie, despite the small amount of screen time. Though the film portrays Zanuck as someone trying to help Merrill by simply testifying before the committee, there was an underlying tone that closely links him to the real-life counterpart. During the late 1940s and into the early or mid-50s, the 20th Century Fox Film Corporation was doing poorly in terms of its commercial sales due to the rise of television. When the Red Scare was coming into full swing, the issue for Zanuck wasn't due to politics, but rather one of control. When the directors, screenwriters, and actors were being affected by it, he saw this as the government interfering with his business, and basically felt that thanks to their actions, he wouldn't be able to make a lot of money. So, for Zanuck, it's all about making sure his filmmaking business keeps raking in the funds. Basically, he just didn't like the fact that the government was just red tagging people who he sees as bankable. Not to mention that Zanuck was, well, to be blunt, a serial sexual abuser. For the sake of not getting so far off topic, I'm going to leave it at that. But I do encourage doing your own research in regards to Xanax's horrible behavior yourself. The main takeaway that we can learn from this film is two things. The first is that the film's main message, which was said through Merrill's dialogue in the climax, but to put things in simple terms, the greatest service that one could do for themselves and for their country is to stand and be true to one's own beliefs. The next is the film's artistic license and creative liberties being utilized correctly. Again, though the story may be fictional, it was able to portray the common experiences of the blacklisted people at this point in American history. The film contends that this era in Hollywood revealed how being ruled by fear can easily make people abandon morality, how tyranny affects people's personal conscience, leaving them to the point of these artists saying, I have no other choice. Obviously, when people discuss the effects of the Red Scare and McCarthyism, they point out the effects it had on freedom of speech. In the topic of Hollywood, some people at times don't really know much about it. All I can say in regards to it is that art is a lot of the time political. Guilty by Suspicion also shows how people could overcome it through moral courage by refusing to be compliant, refusing to give in to the committee's insane demands. Though it may come at a cost, it is the best way to stand against tyranny, by simply standing for your own beliefs.